Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast.
And welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a philosophical Everest, Immanuel Kant's monumental work, The Critique of Pure Reason, or Kritik der reinen Vernunft.
This is one of those books that...
That's the one. And for decades, he was lecturing, writing, and just observing the philosophical chaos of his time. He was initially very much in the rationalist school of thought, Leibniz and Wolff, but then he read the empiricist David Hume, and that, in his famous words, awakened him from his dogmatic slumber.
And Hume's big argument was that core concepts, like cause and effect, aren't universal truths at all. They're just psychological habits we form from seeing one thing follow another over and over.
Exactly, a gut punch. And Kant saw this deep skepticism on one side, and on the other, this long tradition of speculative metaphysics making grand, contradictory claims about God and the soul with no proof.
A total mess.
He called it a state of complete indifference, Genslicher indifferentism. Metaphysics was just a battlefield of endless, useless arguments. Meanwhile, you had fields like mathematics and natural science making steady, rigorous progress.
So his goal wasn't to just create another system to throw into the fight.
Not at all. His goal was to end the war. And to do that, he had to critique the weapon itself, pure reason. He argued that if metaphysics was ever going to be a real science, it needed a secure footing, one with completeness and systematic unity.
And the only way to do that was to turn reason back on itself.
Precisely. To conduct a full critique. To map out its inherent structure, its capabilities, and most importantly, its absolute uncrossable boundaries. He wanted to sort out once and for all where reason can give us solid knowledge and where it just spins its wheels and creates illusions.
Okay, so let's start where he starts, at the absolute foundation. Section 1, his critical revolution. He kicks things off with a distinction that seems simple at first, but everything else is built on it.
It does seem simple, the difference between empirical knowledge and pure knowledge. Kant is perfectly happy to admit that all our knowledge, in terms of time, begins with experience. An object affects our senses, and that's what sort of wakes up our cognitive faculties.
It seems uncontroversial.
It is. But here's the twist. He says, just because our knowledge begins with experience, that doesn't mean it all arises from experience.
Okay, break that down.
He argues we possess knowledge that is necessary and absolutely universal. Knowledge that exists independent of any particular experience. This is what he calls pure knowledge, or a priori.
So something we know is true without having to check every single instance of it.
Exactly. If a judgment is thought with strict universality, so that literally no exception is even possible, it can't come from experience. Experience only ever tells us that something is, so far so good. It can't tell us that it must always be so.
Like every event must have a cause. We haven't seen every event that has ever happened or will ever happen, but we hold that to be a necessary truth.
That's a perfect example. Now, to really dissect this, Kant introduces a second crucial distinction that intersects with the first. So we have a priori versus a posteriori from experience.
And the second one is about the content of the statement itself.
Yeah.
Analytic versus synthetic.
And this is where the engine of the revolution really starts to turn. An analytic judgment is basically just explanatory. The predicate is already contained inside the subject.
Like all bachelors are unmarried.
Perfect. Unmarried is part of the definition of bachelor. You don't need to do a survey of bachelors to confirm it. You just analyze the concept. These judgments don't really expand our knowledge. They just clarify it.
Okay, they just unpack what's already there.
Then you have synthetic judgments. These are expansive. They add new information. The predicate is not contained in the subject. The ball is red. Redness isn't part of the concept of ball. You have to, look at the ball.
So these were traditionally assumed to depend on experience. They were a posteriori.
Right. Analytic was a priori. Synthetic was a posteriori. Simple. But if the world were that simple, Kant would have, as you said, written a pamphlet. The entire critique is driven by his massive central question. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible?
Okay, so how can we have knowledge that is both genuinely new, expansive, and known to be universally true before any experience?
That's the linchpin. That's the question metaphysics must answer to become a science. And Kant says, look, we don't have to wonder if this kind of knowledge exists. It's right in front of us.
In mathematics.
In mathematics, this is such a critical move. Let's take his example. 7 + 5 = 12. He asks, is this analytic or synthetic?
Well, it feels analytic. It feels like it's true by definition.
It does, but Kant says, think about it carefully. Analyze the concept of the union of 7 and 5. All you have in that concept is, well, 7, 5, and the idea of adding them. The concept of 12 is nowhere in there.
Hmm. So you're saying I can't get to 12 just by thinking about 7 plus 5?
Not just by analyzing the concepts alone. He insists you have to go beyond the concepts. You have to call on something he calls intuition. You have to say, picture 7 dots and then actively add 5 more dots to them, one by one. You perform a synthesis in your mind.
Ah, I see. The act of counting up from 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is a constructive act. It's a synthesis.
It's a synthesis. It produces a new concept, 12, that wasn't in the original parts. And yet the result is absolutely necessary and universally true. It's a priori. Same with geometry. A straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. The concept of shortest is an addition. It's not contained in the mere concept of straightness.
So math gives us new knowledge, but it's not based on observing the world. This forces him to look for the source of this knowledge somewhere else, not in objects,
And not in pure abstract reason alone, like the rationalists thought.
but in the subject, in us.
That's it. That is the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus flipped the model from the sun orbiting the Earth to the Earth orbiting the sun to make the math work,
Kant flipped philosophy.
he realized if our knowledge can't conform to objects, maybe objects have to conform to the fundamental structure of our knowledge. Our minds aren't passive blank slates. They actively structure the reality we experience.
Wow, okay, that is a massive shift. And it takes us directly into the first major part of the book, the transcendental aesthetic.
Right. And aesthetic here doesn't mean beauty. It comes from the Greek for sensation. This part is all about sensibility, our capacity to passively receive representations when objects affect us. This is how the world is given to us.
And his goal here is to strip away all the empirical stuff from our sensations, to find what pure, necessary structures must have been there beforehand.
And he finds two fundamental frameworks that we don't learn from the world, but that we use to perceive the world in the first place: space and time.
Let's take space first. Why does he insist that space has to be a pure, a priori intuition?
Well, he's got a couple of knockout arguments. First, he says, the representation of space is necessary. Try to imagine a world with no space.
I can't.
You can imagine empty space, but you can't imagine the absence of space. The very idea of an object being outside of you or next to another object presupposes space. It's the absolute foundation for all our external perceptions.
So it's the stage on which everything external appears. It has to be there before the actors arrive.
Perfect analogy. Second, there's geometry. As we just saw, geometry gives us necessary universal truths about space. If space were just an idea we got from, seeing things next to each other over and over, then the principles of geometry would just be probable. They wouldn't be absolutely certain.
Because experience can always be different tomorrow.
Right. The fact that geometry can determine the properties of space synthetically and a priori proves that space itself must be a pure intuition, a form that exists in our minds before we perceive any specific object in it.
So space isn't a feature of the universe out there. It's a feature of our perceptual system.
Exactly. And he runs the exact same analysis for time, which is the necessary form for our internal perceptions.
How does that work for time?
Just like with space, you can't really derive time from experience. To even perceive that two things happen at the same time, or one after the other, you already need the representation of time to be there, organizing that flow.
It's the framework for succession.
It is. Time, for Kant, is nothing other than the form of the inner sense. Space structures are outer experience of things external to us. But time structures our inner world. Our intuition of ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, they all appear to us in a sequence, in a temporal flow.
Okay, so space and time are the pure forms of all our sensible intuition. This is a huge claim. What is the absolutely critical consequence of this? This is the cornerstone of his whole system, isn't it?
It is. The consequence is earth-shattering. If space and time are merely the subjective conditions of our human way of perceiving things, then they only apply to the world as it appears to us.
What he calls appearances, or Erscheinungen.
Right. They do not apply to the world as it might exist in itself, independently of our perception.
The famous things in themselves, Ding and sich selbst.
This is his transcendental idealism. The objects we see are in space and time only because our minds are built to perceive them that way. If you could somehow subtract our human sensory constitution from the equation, space and time themselves and all the objects within them would just disappear.
That is a very difficult idea to really fully grasp. It sounds almost mystical.
It does, but for Kant, it serves an incredibly practical purpose. By limiting our claims of knowledge to this world of appearances, the phenomenal world, he does two things at once. He secures the absolute certainty of math and geometry because they're grounded in the necessary forms of our own minds.
Okay.
And at the same time, he clears a conceptual space for things that might exist outside those forms. We can never know things in themselves, but by admitting that boundary, we finally understand the unbreakable laws that govern our actual experience. We know what we can know, and we know what we can't.
And that firm boundary is everything to him.
Everything. Having established that foundation of sensibility, space, and time, we now have to move from the passive reception of data to the active part of the mind, the understanding, or Verstand.
We're moving from intuition to thought.
Exactly. This kicks off the transcendental logic, which he splits into the analytic and the dialectic. The analytic is the logic of truth. Its job is to find the pure, a priori concepts that the understanding uses to actually think about an object.
So the understanding's job is to take the raw data, which is already flowing in through the forms of space and time, and then what? Organize it.
Organize it into concepts and judgments. It synthesizes it. And Kant, being Kant, needed a totally systematic way to find the complete set of these pure concepts. He couldn't just list them off. He needed a guiding principle.
And he found it in formal logic.
He did. He had this brilliant insight. He realized that the pure concepts the mind uses to think about objects must correspond perfectly to the logical forms of all possible judgments.
So how we structure a sentence logically reflects how we structure reality conceptually.
That's it. He looked at the tables of judgment from logic, judgments of quantity, of quality, of relation, and modality, and from those, he derived his table of the pure concepts of the understanding. He called them the categories.
And these are things like quantity, substance, cause, and effect.
Exactly. These are like the mind's built-in software. They are not things we learn by looking at the world. They are the rules we apply to the world to make sense of it. The category of substance lets us think of a single thing that persists even when its properties change.
Like a ball that's painted a different color is still the same ball.
Right. And the category of causality allows us to think of a necessary connection between two events, not just a random sequence.
Okay, but this raises a huge question. These categories are just forms of thought. They're just rules in our head. How do they get objective validity? Why should the world of objects out there necessarily play by our mind's internal rules?
Yeah, now you've hit on what is probably the most dense, difficult, but also most brilliant part of the entire critique.
The original synthetic unity of apperception.
The I think. It's the subjective foundation for all possible objective knowledge. The argument is, well, it's pretty abstract. It says that for any representation, any perception, any thought, any memory, to be a representation for me, it must be possible for the I think to accompany it.
So all my different experiences have to belong to a single unified self.
If they didn't, they'd just be a random flashing of disconnected images and sounds. They wouldn't be my experience. This unity of the self, this apperception, is the highest principle of all understanding.
And this gathering and connecting of all that raw data is what he calls synthesis.
Yes, and he stresses that this is not a passive process. It's an active, unifying act of spontaneity carried out by what he calls the productive imagination. The mind is actively building a coherent world.
I think this is where a lot of people get lost. I'm still not quite seeing the link. How does this necessary subjective, I think, make the categories objectively valid? How does it force the world to obey them?
Okay, let's try to break it down. Think of it like this. For our experience to be objective, it must be subject to necessary rules. It can't be random.
Right.
Now, what makes it a unified experience for me is that single unifying consciousness, the I think. The unity of my consciousness is itself a necessary condition. So for the raw data of the world to enter into that unified consciousness, it must conform to the rules that make unity possible.
And the only rules available for that job are the categories?
The categories are those rules. They are the very functions of synthesis that create unity.
Right.
So the necessity of the I think imposes the necessity of the categories onto the manifold of intuition. Any object we can possibly experience must be structured by rules like cause and effect, because that's the only way it can become part of a unified objective experience for a unified subject.
Wow. Okay, so causality isn't in the world. It's the condition for us to experience a coherent world at all.
You've got it. But, and he never lets you forget this, without the raw data from sensibility, without the intuitions given in space and time, the categories are completely empty. They're just hollow forms of thought. They only become tools of real knowledge when they're applied to appearances.
Which brings us to the climax of this whole section.
Yeah.
The transcendental principles.
Right. This is the payoff. These are the fundamental laws of nature that you get when you apply the categories to all possible experience. These are necessary, universal, and they dictate the very structure of the world we live in.
This is where he finally saves science from Hume's skepticism. He divides them into two groups, right? Mathematical and dynamical.
Yes, the mathematical principles apply directly to our intuitions. The first is the axioms of intuition, which comes from the category of quantity.
And this one states that all appearances are extensive magnitudes. What does that mean in plain English?
It just means that anything you perceive in space and time is made of parts that are added together. You don't see a whole line instantly. Your mind synthesizes it part by part. This is what grounds the certainty of geometry.
Okay. And the second one, the anticipations of perception, from the category of quality.
This deals with the content of sensation. It says that every sensation has an intensive magnitude, a degree. Think of the brightness of a light or the heat from a fire. We can know a priori that any reality we sense must have a degree, and that this degree can, in principle, diminish all the way down to zero. We anticipate this, before we even feel a specific sensation.
So we know the basic rules of quantity and quality for everything we could ever perceive.
Yes. Now, for the really big ones, the dynamical principles, also called the analogies of experience. This is Kant's direct, full-force answer to David Hume. These principles govern how objects exist and relate to each other in time.
The first analogy is about substance.
The principle is, in all change, the substance, the underlying stuff, persists. Its quantity in nature never increases or diminishes.
Like matter and energy.
Exactly. The form changes ice to water to vapor, but the underlying substance remains. Kant argues this is a necessary a priori rule because time itself can't be perceived. We need something permanent and unchanging in our perception to serve as the backdrop against which we can even measure change and the flow of time.
Okay, that makes sense. But now for the main event, the second analogy, causality. This was Hume's main target.
And Kant's solution is just brilliant. He flips Hume's argument completely. The principle is, everything that happens, every event, must follow from a preceding state according to a necessary rule, cause and effect.
For Hume, seeing one billiard ball hit another was just a habit of association.
Right. For Hume, the succession is just in our minds. But Kant asks, if that were true, how could we ever distinguish between an objective event in the world and a merely subjective sequence in our own imagination?
What's the difference?
Okay, look, if I look at a house, I can let my eyes wander over it in any order: roof, then window, then door, or door, then window, then roof. The sequence of my perceptions is subjective and totally reversible.
Right.
But if I see a ship sailing down a river, the sequence is objective and irreversible. The ship is upstream first, and then it is downstream. I can't perceive it the other way around. What makes that sequence necessary, and not just my imagination?
The law of cause and effect.
The a priori rule of cause and effect, which my understanding imposes on my perceptions to make objective experience of succession possible in the first place. Without that rule, the world would be no different from a dream. Causality is the structure we impose that creates objective time.
So, once again, it's not a law we discover in the world, it's a law we prescribe to the world of appearances.
And if you are finding the logic of Kant's system compelling, perhaps you'll find our commitment to deep dives compelling too. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast. We appreciate your support as we tackle these mental marathons.
Indeed. Okay, so that handles the order of things in time. What about things that exist at the same time in space? The third analogy, community or reciprocity.
This one states that all substances that coexist in space are in reciprocal interaction. Think about seeing a room full of furniture. You perceive them all as being part of one single simultaneous moment. Kant says this is only possible if we presuppose that they are all dynamically influencing each other, forming a single unified system. Without that assumed rule of reciprocity, our perception would just be a fragmented series of isolated objects.
So the analytic basically builds the world we know.
Hmm?
The mind uses its categories, substance, causality, reciprocity, to weave the raw data of space and time into a coherent, law-governed natural world.
But always, always, only the world of appearances.
And now, just when we think the system is complete and secure, we move to the part where it all seems to break down. Not because of an error, but because of a fundamental human drive. We go from the understanding, which is content to play within the sandbox of experience, to the restless faculty of reason, or vernon of tea.
Exactly. The transcendental dialectic is where Kant analyzes the necessary but totally illusory conclusions that reason comes to when it tries to fly beyond those boundaries of experience.
So what drives reason to do that?
The understanding is happy with conditioned knowledge. If A, then B. But reason is never satisfied with that. It has this inherent, unavoidable drive to find the unconditioned. It wants the ultimate explanation, the first cause, the complete set of all conditions. It wants the whole story.
And that drive pushes it outside the phenomenal world.
Inevitably. And when reason takes its concepts, which were only ever designed to organize experience, and tries to apply them to this unconditioned noumenal realm, it generates what Kant calls the antinomies.
These are contradictions where reason can prove two opposite conclusions with equal logical force.
Perfect paradoxes. And the most famous, the one that is absolutely critical for the possibility of morality, is the third antinomy, freedom versus necessity.
Okay, let's walk through this conflict. On the one hand, we have the thesis.
The thesis argues for causality through freedom. We have to be able to believe in free will. If we don't, then the entire concepts of moral responsibility, law, praise, and blame just dissolve into nothing. We have to believe that we can, as rational beings, spontaneously start a new causal chain in the world.
Makes sense. But then you have the antithesis.
Which argues that everything, without exception, happens according to the laws of natural necessity. This is the foundation of science. Every event has a preceding cause in time. If you allow for some magical, uncaused freedom to just pop into the causal chain, then the entire law-governed structure of nature we just worked so hard to establish in the analytic completely falls apart.
So science demands determinism, and morality demands freedom. And if we're only talking about the world of appearances, these two things are in flat-out contradiction.
They are. It's an unavoidable conflict, unless you remember the fundamental distinction we made right back in the aesthetic. The solution is Kant's masterstroke, his transcendental idealism. It allows us to adopt a dual perspective on a human action.
So how does this dual viewpoint resolve the antinomy without just saying one side is wrong?
We have to view the human agent in two different ways. First, as an appearance, a phenomenon in the sensible world. From that perspective, looking from the outside, every action you take is a determined event in time. It's caused by your genetics, your upbringing, the state of your brain. It fits perfectly into the causal chain of nature.
The scientist's perspective.
Exactly. But second, we can also consider the agent as a thing in itself, as a noumenon, an intelligible character outside of time and space. From this non-sensible viewpoint, the agent as a rational being is free. It is not determined by the causal chain of appearances.
So the intelligible self is the ultimate source of the action.
Yes. It can spontaneously begin a series of events in the sensible world without itself being caused by anything prior in that sensible world. So the very same action can be seen as completely determined from the empirical perspective and as completely free from the intelligible noumenal perspective.
The contradiction just dissolves.
It does, because the two claims are being made about two different realms. The laws of nature and necessity apply only to appearances. Freedom is a property we must postulate of the thing in itself. Kant saves morality without throwing out science. It's an incredible intellectual tightrope walk.
And briefly, he applies a similar logic to the fourth antinomy about a necessary being. Right.
Yes. That's the conflict over whether an absolutely necessary being exists as part of the world or as its cause. The critique shows that any attempt to prove that such a being exists within the sensible world fails, because everything in experience is contingent. It's conditioned by something before it. Reason can form the idea of a necessary being, but it can never, ever know it as an object of experience.
And this failure of speculative reason is actually the whole point.
It is. This leads us right into the final major section. Reason's drive for the unconditioned creates these three great ideas: the soul, the world as a totality, and the supreme being, or God. Reason, in its search for absolute completeness, conceives of this ideal of pure reason.
And this ideal is what philosophers for centuries had used to try and prove God's existence. And Kant just systematically dismantles those proofs.
One by one. He shows they're all based on fallacies. Let's start with the big one, the ontological proof.
That's the one that argues from the concept of a perfect being to its existence, right?
Right.
A perfect being must have the perfection of existence, so it must exist.
Yes, and Kant's takedown is devastatingly simple. He argues that existence is not a real predicate. A predicate adds to a concept. If I say God is omnipotent, I'm adding a quality to the concept of God.
Okay.
But if I say God exists, I'm not adding another quality to my concept. I'm positing that the concept itself, with all its qualities, is instantiated in reality.
Can you give us an analogy?
He gives a great one. Think of the concept of 100 thalers, an old currency. I can have a perfect concept of 100 thalers in my mind, what they're made of, their size, their weight. Now, does the concept of 100 thalers in my pocket contain anything more than the concept of 100 thalers that are merely possible?
The concept is identical.
Exactly. The real 100 thalers in my pocket has the added reality, the existence, but that doesn't change the concept one bit. Existence has to be shown through experience or intuition. You can't get there just by analyzing a definition.
So the cosmological proof, which argues from the existence of the world back to a necessary first cause, must be stronger. No.
It seems more grounded, but Kant shows it ultimately fails because it secretly leans on the broken ontological proof. After it argues that some necessary being must exist, it has to figure out what that being is. And it always concludes it must be the most perfect being, the being whose essence includes existence, which is just the ontological argument snuck in the back door.
And what about the last one, the most intuitive one, the physico-theological proof, the argument from design?
This one, he says, is the oldest and clearest, and he respects it, but it also fails to prove what it sets out to. It looks at the incredible order and harmony in nature and infers an intelligent designer.
That seems reasonable.
It is, but what does it actually prove? At best, it proves a world architect, Weltbaumeister, who is powerful enough to arrange the existing matter of the universe. It doesn't prove a world creator, Weltschöpfer, who creates matter itself out of nothing. It proves a very powerful but potentially limited designer, not the all-sufficient, infinite God of theology.
So theoretical reason just hits a brick wall. It cannot deliver knowledge about God, freedom, or immortality. But this failure is actually a victory for Kant.
A calculated victory. This brings us to his most famous statement, I had to destroy knowledge to make room for faith, or Ich musste das Wissen aufheben, zum Glauben Platz zu bekommen. He saw that the dogmatic claims of metaphysics were the real source of unbelief because they invited equally dogmatic refutations. By drawing a hard line around what reason can know, he secures a protected space for what reason must believe.
And this moves us to the ultimate purpose of his whole project, the practical destination of pure reason.
Yes. All of this work serves to answer three ultimate questions. 1, what can I know? The critique has answered that. Only the world of appearances. 2, what should I do? That's the subject of his moral philosophy. And 3, what may I hope?
And that third question is the bridge.
It is. It connects morality to happiness and creates the need for what he calls moral faith. The moral law inside us commands us absolutely. It's an a priori fact of reason. We must strive for the highest good, which means achieving perfect virtue and deserving proportional happiness. But for that goal to not be a cruel joke, we have to be able to postulate the conditions that make it possible.
And those conditions are the very things theoretical reason couldn't prove.
Precisely. To achieve perfect virtue is the work of a lifetime, maybe even an infinite one. So the moral law requires us to postulate the immortality of the soul. And since the natural world offers no guarantee that being virtuous will make you happy, we must postulate the existence of God as a moral author of the universe who ensures that, in the end, virtue and happiness will align.
But this isn't knowledge. It's not a proof.
No, it's a moral certainty. It's a rational, necessary conviction that follows from our duty as moral beings. He's secured faith on the unshakable ground of practical reason, which is far safer, in his view, than any flimsy speculative proof.
So before we wrap this all up, let's circle back to those big ideas of reason, God, soul, world totality. If they can't be known as objects, what good are they?
They cannot be constitutive principles. They don't constitute or create any new objects for us to know.
So they must be regulative. What does that mean for how we actually do science?
It means they function as indispensable guiding principles for the understanding. They push us to seek the maximum possible systematic unity in our knowledge. For example, we should investigate nature as if it were the product of a supreme, intelligent designer.
Even though we can never prove that it is.
Right. We don't assume it as a fact, but using it as a guiding hypothesis forces us to look for deeper connections, for underlying laws, for purpose and unity in nature. It pushes science forward. These ideas are the focus points that guide our empirical research toward a completeness it would never seek on its own.
He really did try to give every faculty of the mind its proper job and its proper limits. He creates what he calls the peace of a lawful state for philosophy.
A lasting peace by drawing clear borders.
Okay, that brings us to our final synthesis. For everyone listening who has stuck with us on this marathon deep dive, let's try to distill the absolute core takeaways from Kant's massive achievement.
Number one has to be the critical foundation, the Copernican turn. Knowledge isn't just passive reception. Objects must conform to the a priori structures of our minds.
2. The subjective forms. Space and time are not features of ultimate reality. They are the subjective forms of our intuition, the lens through which we perceive the world of phenomena or appearances.
3. The objective rules. The categories, like causality, are the necessary a priori rules that our understanding uses to construct a coherent objective experience. They are the source of the laws of nature as we know them.
4. The boundaries. Theoretical reason has strict limits. It's confined to the world of possible experience. When it tries to go beyond that, to grasp things in themselves, it falls into unavoidable illusion, into the antinomies.
And finally, 5. The practical pivot. The very failure of theoretical reason to answer the big questions about God, freedom, and immortality is what creates the necessary space for moral faith, a rational belief grounded in the demands of our practical, moral lives.
He secured the objectivity of science by limiting its domain, and at the same time, he provided a rational foundation for morality and faith. The ultimate goal of pure reason, then, isn't some abstract speculation. It's the practical world, establishing a firm system for human action.
Absolutely. And to leave you with a final provocative thought that builds on Kant's architecture. If our entire objective reality, our very concepts of space, time, cause, and substance, is fundamentally shaped by the necessary structures of the human mind, what does that imply for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence? An intelligence whose own necessary forms of intuition and categories of understanding might be completely unimaginably different from our own. Could their laws of nature be something that our minds are literally incapable of grasping?
That is a mind-bending question, a perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the very architecture of reason.